This content is presented for educational and documentary purposes. It does not promote or glorify violence or criminal behavior. He didn't enter the scene like a monster. He showed up like someone who needed a favor. A quick smile, a calm voice, a simple request. And when the door opened, literally or emotionally, what came next wasn't just violence. It was control. It was possession. It was a mind trying to prove at any cost that it had power over another person's fate. Between 1974 and 1978, young women began to disappear as if the country had developed blind spots. There wasn't a single crime scene, there wasn't a specific neighborhood, there wasn't an obvious suspect. There was only the repetition: someone vanishes, and the world keeps moving for a few hours, until it realizes it never should have. And then a name emerges: Ted Bundy, a man who seemed safe enough to help, educated enough to trust, ordinary enough to go unnoticed. What happens when the predator doesn't need to hide in the dark, because he can hide in normalcy? This is the case of Ted Bundy, the serial killer who became a classic study in forensic psychology, not only for what he did, but for how he managed to look like someone who never would. Part 1. Opening the case file. The file opens with a sharp, dry sound, like an old police station drawer being yanked open in a hurry. Inside, there isn't a single crime. There's an entire map of the United States marked with dots, dates, and the names of young women who left home and never came back. Between 1974 and 1978, a period of intense cultural change, a string of disappearances and murders of young women crossed different states as if it were following an invisible route. The thread connecting it all had a name: Theodore Robert Bundy, Ted Bundy. To understand why this case became a classic study in forensic psychology, you have to go back to the atmosphere of the time. The 1970s in the US were fertile ground for contradictions: sexual freedom and political distrust in the post-Watergate era, universities growing as centers of youth and mobilization, and at the same time, a still fragmented public safety system with local departments trying to solve crimes in their city without the level of data integration that today seems obvious. People disappeared, and many times it was treated as a runaway, a family fight, an impulsive decision. The term serial killer was beginning to take shape in the popular imagination, but it still wasn't an automatic red flag on an investigator's desk. The opening setting of this file is the Pacific Northwest, especially the state of Washington. College towns, parks, back roads, parking lots, and paths that seemed far too safe to spark fear. The country still believed, to some extent, in the idea that danger looked like danger. And that's where the case becomes a surgical cut into collective trust. Bundy didn't look like a typical predator. He presented himself as someone educated, articulate, often described as friendly, the kind of person who walks into a room and doesn't set off immediate alarms. That discrepancy, that social mask, is part of what made the case spread not only as news, but as cultural trauma, the fear of the normal man. Throughout 1974, reports emerge of attacks and disappearances that, seen in isolation, could be just disconnected tragedies. But over time, investigators began to notice patterns. Young women, many of them college-aged, ordinary routines, everyday contexts. While families taped up posters and waited for calls that never came, authorities faced an uncomfortable question. How can someone act repeatedly in different places without being noticed? The country still didn't have the network of cameras, digital trails, and integrated databases. Mobility was an advantage for someone who wanted to disappear into the landscape itself. And the landscape in this case was vast. Investigations and suspicions moved through multiple states: Washington, Utah, Colorado, and later Florida, as if crime had learned to cross borders before police learned to connect the dots. When the name Ted Bundy begins to surface more consistently, he is no longer just a suspect. He is the frightening possibility of an attacker who understood people, not only as victims but as a system. Trust, empathy, education, courtesy, everything that in a functioning society serves to bring people closer, was being used there as a tool of domination. This case also fits into a crucial moment for the FBI itself. the birth and strengthening of what would become behavioral analysis applied to violent crime. The idea of studying patterns, motivations, and psychological signatures, instead of relying only on physical evidence, was gaining ground. Bundy becomes, then, a kind of dark mirror for that emerging field. A criminal who seemed to build a conventional life on the outside, while feeding something predatory on the inside. The FBI recognized how cases like these pushed the development of behavioral analysis and how Bundy became central to that institutional learning. When the judicial gears finally start to tighten, the case stops being just an investigation. It becomes a national spectacle. Bundy was arrested in 1975, and the proceedings, including escape episodes in 1977, only increased the public sense that there was an enemy there who refused to be contained. Escaping isn't just disappearing, it's asserting power, humiliating the system, reigniting panic. For the families of the missing, every headline was a reopened wound. And then comes the geographic and symbolic pivot. Florida, 1978. The case becomes impossible to regionalize. It hits the American imagination at full force when events linked to the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University explode as headlines and as proof of a brutal escalation. From that point on, the name Bundy is no longer a rumor from distant precincts. He is a real figure in the news, a face associated with a kind of horror that invades collective spaces. Florida state court records deal directly with those events and the convictions that followed, fixing the case in the country's legal history. What makes this file even more disturbing, and this is where the camera pushes in on the psychological mood, is the coexistence of two narratives: the socially functional man and the attacker who, behind the scenes, operated with a logic of control, possession, and destruction. This isn't mystery in a romantic sense, it's an anatomy of manipulation. The 70s saw the birth of awareness that some predators don't hide in the shadows. They walk in bright light, talk, laugh, shake hands. And for that very reason, they can get close. This is the case in which the US, and then the world, was forced to face an uncomfortable question. What if danger isn't a visibly threatening stranger, but someone who knows how to seem safe? In 1974, the file started filling with names. In 1978, it already carried the weight of national mourning. And from then on, nothing about trust was ever simple again. Part 2, The Mind Behind the Crimes. He was born under a different name, and that is not a trivial detail in this file. Theodore Robert Cowell, later known as Ted Bundy, came into the world on November 24, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, at an institution for unmarried mothers. The identity of his biological father remained uncertain for decades, and the very theme of origin shows up like a recurring shadow when you try to understand this man's psychological construction. An unstable core of identity, full of gaps, as if the biography had been written with missing pages. In his early years, Bundy was raised in a family arrangement that, for many children, would already be confusing. Some accounts indicate that for a time he believed his mother was his sister, a story that, whether or not it is true in every detail, points to an environment of secrets and silences. Some relatives describe the early household as violent and tense. Others challenge those versions over time. The practical result for a child's emotional development is the same. When the adults around you don't offer a clear, safe narrative, the mind learns early to live with duplicity, and sometimes to use duplicity as a tool. In the early 1950s, his mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, moved with her son to Tacoma, Washington. Soon after, she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, and Ted took his stepfather's last name. It's a family reconfiguration that, on the outside, suggests stability. A new city, a new name, an attempt at a normal life. But in many cases of a personality marked by a need for control and validation, normal isn't exactly a home. It's a mask, a stage, a place where a person learns what they're supposed to look like in order to be accepted. As a teenager and young man, Bundy is described as someone who chased social fitting in, status, and belonging. He's not the stereotype of the isolated, visibly broken guy. He moves through academic environments, tries to position himself as someone with promise, interested in politics and public causes. That layer is crucial, the appearance of a future plan. To many people around him, he was the kind of guy who's going to make it. And that contrast is exactly what makes the case so disturbing, because the violence, when it appears, doesn't seem to come from an obvious monster. It seems to come from someone who learned to imitate what society calls decency. When he enters college life, with time at the University of Washington among other institutions, Bundy gravitates toward spaces where prestige matters, debates, ambition, circles that reward verbal intelligence and charisma. He didn't need to be the brightest person in the room, he just needed to look like it. In profiles like this, image is a kind of emotional currency, being seen as superior, as deserving, as someone special. When that image threatens to collapse, what can come next is anger, resentment, and a desperate sprint to regain control. It's in this period that a key element appears for the psychological script: romantic rejection. There are multiple public narratives about a relationship in the late 1960s, early 1970s, with a woman often identified by a pseudonym in books and reporting. For example, Diane Edwards. Accounts suggest that the breakup, associated with differences in social class expectations and life trajectory, was felt by him as humiliation. In records and interviews cited by programs and reports, Bundy even admitted that the relationship had a lasting impact on him. Psychologically, this isn't a typical broken heart. It's the experience of having a grandiose fantasy interrupted by someone who chose to leave. For a profile with traits consistent with vulnerable narcissism, that mix of grandiosity and fragility, it can be experienced as an intolerable wound. And then there's the so-called double life. But it's important to understand what that means here. It isn't just hiding crimes, it's managing versions of himself. One version: the polite, helpful guy who knows how to talk, who understands the social timing of a compliment, a joke, a focused look. A version that sometimes offers what the other person wants to feel: safety. Another version: an inner life of fantasies, resentments, entitlement, as if the world owed him. That second version isn't a cartoon demon. It's colder and more dangerous. It rationalizes, minimizes, convinces. It turns people into functional objects. It reduces the other person to a piece on a board. Bundy became a central case precisely because of this ability to keep the social self running while the predatory self kept advancing. The FBI, in describing the campaign of terror and the interstate manhunt, highlights how investigators in multiple states were trying to connect the dots while he was still moving, still hiding behind routines that looked normal on the surface. There's also an element of competition with the system. Bundy didn't just want to escape, he wanted to prove superiority. That shows up in an emblematic way in the Escape episodes, 1977, when he managed to slip out of the authorities' control for distinct stretches of time. And psychologically, that feeds a cycle. If he fools the police, he wins. If he wins, he feels entitled. It isn't just physical freedom, it's a power intoxication. Another biographical detail that often shocks people, but needs to be handled carefully. Bundy was a man who married and had a daughter. That fact doesn't contradict the violence. It reinforces the mechanism of compartmentalization, the ability to keep mental drawers separate as if life had locked rooms. This isn't a supernatural skill. It's a kind of progressive moral numbing, and it can intensify when a person learns they can sustain two narratives without being unmasked. In many accounts, Bundy shows up as someone who valued status symbols: good looks, posture, rhetoric, the feeling of being noticed. That ties directly to the premise you asked for: social charm, narcissism, and control. Charm here isn't simple romantic seduction. It's a technique for managing the other person. It's understanding what the other person expects and offering that as emotional bait. In profiles like this, empathy can be performed, not because the person feels with the other, but because they learned what empathy looks like from the outside. What makes this portrait even more unsettling is the fact that Bundy did, in fact, become an object of study. Not out of fascination, but out of necessity. He forced criminology and forensic psychology to face a hard reality. The reality that an attacker can be socially functional and still be profoundly dangerous. The FBI itself notes how the development of behavioral analysis and the understanding of the serial killer phenomenon consolidated in that period, with Bundy becoming an unavoidable reference in investigative culture. When you put everything together, the murky origin, the hunger for validation, the wound of rejection, the social mask, the desire to win, a coherent psychological sketch emerges. A man who couldn't tolerate feeling small. And when the world didn't give him the greatness he believed he deserved, he tried to rip it out by force. Not just by dominating situations, but by dominating people. At this point in the file, the question isn't, how did he seem so normal? The more useful and more terrifying question is, how much did he train himself to seem normal? Part 3. Who these victims really were. Ted Bundy's victims shared something in common that doesn't show up in statistics. They were living ordinary life. Going to class, coming home from work, sleeping in their own beds, crossing a campus with the typical confidence of someone who believes the world still follows basic rules. Between 1974 and 1978, that everyday routine was pierced by disappearances and deaths that at first seemed like isolated tragedies, until they became a terrifying pattern across multiple states. How many victims? Confirmed, confessed, and presumed Bundy confessed to 30 murders on the eve of his execution, spread across several states, but the real total remains unknown and is treated by investigators and researchers as potentially higher. In widely used public lists, there is a set of confirmed victims and a set of attributed suspected victims, precisely because not all bodies were recovered and not all cases reached a definitive evidentiary conclusion. That uncertainty carries a specific human weight. It means that for some families, time never closes the door. Grief gets stuck in a hallway, without certainty, without a complete ritual, without a last page. The general profile of the victims. Most known victims were young women, many college-aged in states like Washington, Utah, and Colorado, with the case drawing even more national attention in Florida in 1978. They weren't a type in the shallow sense. They were rather people at a point in life when identity and the future are being built. Friendships, first big choices, newly won independence. In many incidents, what you see is a social vulnerability, the way we're taught to trust. Helping someone who looks like they need it, believing a calm tone of voice, not suspecting a well-groomed stranger. The tragedy is that these virtues in certain hands become an entry point. How they were killed, what can be stated without turning pain into spectacle. In general, reliable historical and biographical sources describe that Bundy often murdered his victims using physical violence and asphyxiation, with recurring blunt force trauma, beating, bludgeoning, and strangulation. That detail matters for a psychological reason. This isn't just killing. In many cases, those methods indicate direct bodily domination, forced proximity, and total control over the pace of the ending, something that later connects to the central theme of the case, power and possession. On the night of the attack at Chi Omega, at Florida State University, January 15, 1978, court documents describe that the attacker assaulted women while they slept, and that the victims were struck repeatedly with a blunt object. 2 students died and others suffered severe injuries. This is not a morbid detail. It's the legal confirmation of an escalation that broke a symbolic barrier. A shared college home, where a body should be able to rest, turned into a scene of terror. The 2 fatal victims that night were Margaret Elizabeth Bowman, 21, and Lisa Janet Levy, 20. And there's a point that often gets lost when the case becomes headlines. Survivors existed. Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler survived the attack in the house with serious injuries. In addition, Cheryl Thomas was attacked shortly afterward in another nearby residence, and she also survived. The survivors are a moral part of the file. They carried forever the memory of what happened, and at the same time, helped the system turn horror into proof. A few weeks later, the violence hit a point of national shock with the murder of Kimberly Diane Leach, 12, in Florida. In public records about the case, there is mention that the condition of the body made it difficult to establish the exact cause of death. described instead as the result of homicidal violence, which shows, among other things, how forensic certainty can be limited by time and recovery conditions. What matters here is the impact. A child taken from an ordinary school day, and an entire community reminded that the threat no longer respected any imaginary line. The victims as the center, not as chapters. Bundy often grew in the public narrative because there was in him the scandal of the double life. But this script does not exist to feed his mask. It exists to give weight back to those who were turned into a number. Each name in each state represents a brutal interruption. Parents left without answers, classmates who grew older with questions, towns that learned to distrust the simplest gesture. And in a case with confessions and gaps, there is also an added grief, that of families who may never receive final confirmation, because the criminal deliberately left the trail incomplete, as if even the truth were something he wanted to control. Part 4. Behavioral Signature. Ted Bundy's behavioral signature wasn't static. It evolved, and that evolution is one of the most dangerous signals in serial crimes. When an offender learns from his own trail, he becomes more selective, more calculating, and often harder to contain. Historical sources and official analyses describe exactly that, a pattern that becomes progressively more organized, with greater control over the victim, the scene, and the risk. Victim selection, youth, accessibility, and social silence. Across the known victims, one slice predominates: young women, largely connected to everyday college life, many between their teens and early adulthood. In Washington and regions associated with the earliest cases, investigators observed that several missing women shared similarities in appearance: young, attractive, often with longer hair. Though the degree of uniformity in this profile is debated in accounts and by Bundy himself. The selection wasn't only aesthetic, it was strategic. Young people tend to be out and about more, have more predictable routines, trust environments like campuses and central areas, and crucially, being gone for a few hours might not trigger an immediate alarm. That window of time was gold for an offender who needed to move, conceal, erase. Approach, charm as a tool, and the help bait. The most distinctive aspect of Bundy's method was his ability to get close without causing immediate fear. Instead of always attacking on impulse, he often built access. A conversation, an impression, a small piece of social theater. Recurring accounts indicate that he used ruses to lower a victim's guard, such as appearing injured, for example with his arm in a sling or a leg immobilized, and asking for help with something simple, or even presenting himself as a figure of authority in some approaches. This detail is psychologically decisive. It wasn't just about tricking someone. It was about making the victim participate in the first step, turning empathy and politeness into a trap. Charm here isn't romanticized. It functions as an instrument of manipulation, offering normalcy in order to harvest compliance, and it ties directly to the double life. On the outside, someone socially acceptable. On the inside, someone who sees people as functional objects. The attack setting, from public space to total control. There's a pattern repeated across multiple cases. The approach begins in ordinary places, parking lots, high traffic areas, near campuses, and quickly shifts into a context where the offender has the advantage. In that dynamic, the vehicle shows up as an important piece in the case's literature, including archives and public narratives that link specific cars to the investigations. The goal wasn't only to take the victim away. It was to trade an environment with witnesses for an environment of absolute domination. And when that control is the central motivation, the violence tends to be intimate and direct. Not emotionally intimate, but physically. Proximity, imposition, the erasure of autonomy. Type of crime and manner of death: physical violence, asphyxiation, and dominion. In general, historical sources on the case describe that Bundy frequently killed by strangulation, asphyxiation, and by blunt force violence, beating, cranial trauma. This point is essential because it reveals the signature of control. These are ways of killing that require contact, time, decision, and they indicate that the victim's ending was part of the experience of power. There is also consistent reference to sexual violence associated with multiple crimes. Here, the script stays responsible. It's not a detail to shock, it's a component of the criminological pattern that will be essential to the deeper psychological analysis later. Because in cases like this, sex and violence tend to fuse as a language of possession, not as affectionate desire. Chi Omega, break and escalation of the method. In January 1978 in Florida, something occurs that is an outlier in terms of setting: the attack on the Chi Omega sorority house near Florida State University. The Florida Supreme Court describes that an intruder attacked 4 resident women. 2 died, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, and 2 survived with serious injuries, Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler. The same record also reports another attack shortly afterward on Cheryl Thomas in another nearby residence. This episode matters for the behavioral signature because it shows another face of control. No longer the social approach in public space, but a nighttime break-in and an attack on victims at maximum vulnerability, sleeping. It's a shift that suggests urgency, growing disorganization, or a sense of impunity. Classic escalation elements when an offender has spent too long winning. The internal logic: crime as a ritual of power. Bundy's method wasn't only operational, it was psychological. The bait, a false need. The transition into a place of domination, the direct physical violence, and the repetition point to one central function: absolute control. He wasn't only trying to avoid getting caught. He was trying to experience again and again the sensation of deciding everything: who trusts, who goes along, who loses their voice, who disappears. That kind of logic tends to create a cycle. The more he gets away with it, the more he believes he can, and the more external reality, law, morality, limits, becomes just an obstacle to outmaneuver. Part 5. The investigation and the hunt for the mind behind the crimes. In the beginning, there wasn't the Bundy case. There were cases, separate by cities, precincts, routines, a disappearance here, a body found there. Families in shock, college campuses trying to keep living, and investigators working with what they had: phone calls, paper, witness memory, and the bitter intuition that this wasn't just bad luck. In Washington, when young women started vanishing, the details seemed too small to hold up a single theory. But terror often begins like that, with the pileup of small coincidences. In witness statements, a figure keeps reappearing, a young man with an ordinary look, sometimes on crutches or with his arm in a sling, asking for help. And an element that would become almost a symbol of the case: a Volkswagen Beetle. The King County investigation, associated with the work of Detective Robert D. Keppel, brought together another crucial point. Witnesses at Lake Sammamish State Park reported that a man named Ted had approached women shortly before disappearances. The lead was both valuable and frustrating. Ted wasn't a rare name, and still, it was a start. Keppel narrowed a large list of suspects down to about 25, and Ted Bundy was on it. Even so, the machinery didn't lock into place. What was missing was what every investigation desperately wants: a solid point of contact between suspect and crime, a mistake, a testimony, something the offender couldn't control. And then the case migrates, as if the violence had wheels. Bundy moves to Utah, and with that move comes one of the most decisive pieces of the entire hunt: a survivor. In November 1974, Carol Duranch, then 18, escaped an attack and lived to tell it. She became what serial killers fear: a living voice that contradicts the mask. Her name appears repeatedly in historical and journalistic reconstructions of the case, because her testimony and later identification helped turn suspicion into a person, and a person into a defendant. The hunt truly accelerates on August 16, 1975, when a Utah Highway Patrol officer, Robert Hayward, stops a Volkswagen in the early morning hours and arrests Bundy for violations and for items that raised suspicion. It isn't the glamorous scene of a movie. It's the kind of stop that depends on attention, discomfort, and that instinct you get when something doesn't add up. Years later, Utah media itself highlighted the timing and historical weight of that moment. 3 a.m. An apparently routine stop, and one of the country's biggest predators sitting inside the car. The arrest in Utah was the first major knot pulled tight, and when Utah called Washington, the feeling for investigators was that they were finally touching the outline of the enemy. The motive seemed to cut across states. The Ted from the witness accounts now had a face, a full name, an address, a routine. From there, something that was beginning to gain ground in the 1970s, and that today seems obvious, steps into the frame, connecting behavioral patterns. The FBI describes that period as part of the consolidation of behavioral analysis and highlights how that kind of approach helped make sense of serial criminals, including Bundy, when physical evidence wasn't always sufficient or available. But the story doesn't move in a straight line. It twists. Bundy is transferred and prosecuted, but he doesn't accept the role of captured for long. In 1977, while facing charges in Colorado, he escapes, and the fact that he was able to do it exposes security failures and also a central psychological trait of the case: the need to prove dominance over the system. In the first escape on June 7, 1977, he was at a courthouse in Aspen with access to a law library, and he used an opportunity to vanish. He was recaptured days later, but the message had been delivered. He wanted to be seen as someone who can always find a way. The second escape is even more symbolic. Late 1977, a period when many people let their guard down. The FBI records that he escaped from a Colorado jail during the holidays, when part of the staff was away. It's not just escape, it's reading the environment, timing, exploiting other people's relaxation. The hunt goes back to square one, but now with an aggravating factor: a criminal who, after escaping, may feel untouchable. And when a predator feels untouchable, he tends to speed up. He tends to take bigger risks, to think he's above any limit. In January 1978 in Florida, the violence erupts into a scene that becomes a collective nightmare: the Chi Omega sorority house near Florida State University. There, the investigation relies on elements that a court later described as central: testimony from a resident who saw him, forensic analysis of bite marks compared to Bundy's dentition, along with supporting evidence such as hair comparisons, presence in the area, and episodes of fleeing when he spotted police in the weeks that followed. Those details matter because they show how law enforcement built the bridge between the socially plausible man and the real attacker, not through one single stroke of luck, but through a mosaic. Small pieces that, together, draw a figure impossible to ignore. In February 1978, the hunt goes national. Bundy is placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list on February 10th. 5 days later, on February 15, 1978, he is arrested in Pensacola, Florida, after being stopped while driving a stolen car. That record is direct and official. It's in the FBI's own historical material. And at that point, the investigation stops chasing shadows and starts cornering a real man with a name, a face, crimes connected across states, and a psychological pattern. The hunt wasn't only police work, it was institutional. It was a country learning in real time that charisma is not character, and that some predators don't hide in the night. They hide in the look of everyday life. Part 6. The Endgame. Capture, Trial, and Closure. Ted Bundy's final capture in February 1978 wasn't the immediate end of the case. It was the beginning of its most public phase. From that point on, the man who had crossed state lines, deceived systems, and escaped twice began fighting for another kind of control of the narrative. Arrested in Florida after weeks of chaos and collective fear, Bundy entered the judicial system already surrounded by a rare combination: technical evidence, survivors, witnesses, and an entire country watching. What many expected was a broken, beaten, silent defendant. But Bundy didn't operate that way. He kept trying to be the author of his own character, even in the face of accusations involving murder, attempted murder, and break-ins. The trial that became a spectacle, and the need to be in command. In the case tied to the Chi Omega crimes, the Florida Supreme Court describes the core of it: 2 deaths, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, 3 attempted murders, and burglaries, with the death penalty applied for the murders. And here an element appears that would become symbolic. Bundy insisted on handling part of his own defense. In records and historical reconstructions, this behavior is described as a constant effort to dominate the environment. Question, interrupt, perform, turn the courtroom into a stage. It wasn't only a legal strategy, it was a behavioral trait. The difficulty of accepting the role of the subordinate. For someone driven by image and narcissism, being judged is also being reduced. And Bundy resisted that reduction as if his very identity depended on it. Coverage of the case reached international scale. And the irony is cruel. The more he appeared well-groomed, articulate, presentable, the more it reinforced the lesson the country was being forced to learn, that charisma is not character. The evidence that cornered him and why it mattered. The Florida Supreme Court's decision details the pillars that supported the conviction in the Chi Omega case. Among them, 2 points stand out. 1. Identification by a resident who saw him inside the house. 2. Forensic analysis of bite marks compared to Bundy's dentition. 3. The court also describes supporting evidence, his presence in the area, hair comparisons, episodes of fleeing when police got close, along with incriminating statements. That evidence matters not only for the sentence, but for the psychological understanding of the case. Bundy didn't fall because of one dramatic mistake. He fell because of an accumulation, and that is often the fate of organized predators. They don't lose because they get dumb. They lose because the trail, sooner or later, becomes too big to fit inside silence. The conviction and the line that became a portrait of the paradox. Bundy received death sentences related to the Chi Omega murders, and the Florida Supreme Court upheld the trial and the punishment. At sentencing, Judge Edward Cowart made a remark that became known for capturing the case's moral shock, the idea of potential beside the abyss, lamenting a loss of humanity, and pointing to the contradiction between appearance and monstrosity. "You'd have made a good lawyer, Ted. It's a tragedy you went another way." It's a scene that unsettles because it reveals something real. Bundy could trigger ambivalence in people who, rationally, had every reason to hate him. That was one of his social powers, and also a historical warning. The second trial, Kimberly Leach and the third death sentence, the case didn't stop at Chi Omega. Bundy was also tried for the kidnapping and murder of Kimberly Leach, 12. The Florida Supreme Court records that he was indicted on July 21, 1978. The case changed venue, and he was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and first-degree murder, with a jury recommendation of the death penalty. Taken together, these convictions cemented the legal endgame. Bundy was officially marked for 3 murders in Florida, even though the country knew the real story was much bigger. Behavior at the end. Late confessions and control as a final addiction. In his final years on death row, Bundy tried, repeatedly, to reopen legal doors. And when execution drew closer, the phase of late confessions arrived. Conversations with investigators, attempts at negotiation, selective delivery of information. Historical sources highlight that he began admitting to a large number of crimes only very near the end, as if the truth were a final currency to buy time. That detail is psychologically crucial. Even facing death, he tried to turn knowledge into power. It wasn't pure remorse, it was bargaining, influence, steering. The execution, last meal and last words. Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair on January 24, 1989, at Florida State Prison. The Los Angeles Times records the moment and the atmosphere. Witnesses the state's cold ritual and the reaction outside. People celebrating the death as if it were a public event. According to that same report, when asked whether he had any last words, Bundy told attorney Jim Coleman and Minister Fred Lawrence to give his love to family and friends. As for the last meal, he refused to choose a special one and received the traditional meal described in journalistic records: steak, eggs, hash browns, toast, milk, and juice. After that, the final status is simple and definitive. He died executed in the electric chair, and the country, although relieved, was not healed. Because Bundy wasn't just a criminal, he was a case that taught brutally that appearance can be a weapon. Part 7. Psychological breakdown of the case. Ted Bundy didn't become a classic case in forensic psychology because he was mysterious. He became a classic case because he was instructive, in the worst way possible. He showed in raw flesh that a predator can learn to wear the skin of the normal, and underneath it operate an internal system of domination. And he also showed something else more uncomfortable, that society often confuses appearance with essence, eloquence with truth, education with character. His psychological analysis has to begin where most stories prefer not to begin. Need. Not practical need, money, survival, escape. The raw, intimate emotional need that structures how someone sees himself and sees the world. In many biographical accounts, Bundy appears as someone who wanted to be seen as intelligent, promising, respectable, and in fact, he moved through environments where prestige and performance matter: university, politics, law, public spaces. On the outside, he learned the language of success. On the inside, everything suggests he was fighting a silent war against a corrosive sense of inadequacy, the feeling of not being special enough. That kind of internal tension usually generates two paths. Either a person develops humility and real attachment, or they develop masks. Bundy chose the mask. And when the mask stops sustaining the hunger to be someone, the mind starts looking for other forms of compensation, and in certain profiles, that compensation becomes control over people. Context of life and the psychological ground, unstable identity, secrets, and the fabrication of a self. He was born as Theodore Robert Cowell, with biologic paternity historically uncertain in public records, and he grew up surrounded by a family narrative full of gaps. The very story of who he was didn't begin clearly. In widely circulated accounts, he was raised for a time believing his grandparents were his parents, and that his mother was his sister. Later, he moves with his mother to Tacoma, and begins using the last name Bundy after her marriage. Regardless of whether every detail is remembered with precision, biographies diverge. The psychological impact of growing up around secrets is predictable. The child learns that identity can be negotiated, that versions can be maintained in parallel. For most people, that becomes insecurity and anxiety. For some profiles, it becomes a skill, the skill of being whatever is necessary to gain acceptance, and then power. It's important not to fall into a simplistic explanation like, he had a hard childhood, so he became this. Millions have hard childhoods and never hurt anyone. What matters here is the combination, a possible core of shame, instability, plus a temperament geared toward performance, plus an appetite for control. That combination is explosive when it meets a world where charisma is rewarded, and Bundy was rewarded. He attended the University of Washington, studied psychology, worked at a suicide prevention center, and moved through political environments, experiences that on the surface suggest empathy and citizenship. For forensic analysis, that contrast isn't irony, it's mechanism. He didn't need to feel empathy in order to learn how empathy presents. He could learn the language of human pain the way someone learns a language by immersion, and then use that language to open doors. This is one of the points that explains why he is so often cited as an organized case. Not because he was a genius, but because he understood social dynamics. The FBI, in recounting the campaign of terror and the interstate manhunt, emphasizes how he exploited investigative gaps and moved through different states, sustaining a functional appearance. Dominant traits: fragile grandiosity, instrumental charm, and utilitarian coldness. When you observe Bundy's behavior, and not only the content of the crimes, traits appear that align with a well-known cluster in forensic psychology: superficial charm and social adaptability. He seemed to fit in many environments. This doesn't have to be genuine charm. It can be a kind of quick read of the other person. The predator learns who wants to help, who wants to be kind, who is afraid of seeming rude. It becomes a game. Need for status and image, the insistence on presenting himself as a law student, the willingness to perform in court, and the attempt to run his own defense suggest a mind that cannot tolerate being reduced to an ordinary defendant. It's not just strategy, it's identity, What he can't control, he tries to theatricalize. Moral coldness and objectification. In many serial violent crimes, the core isn't explosive rage, it's utility. The victim isn't seen as a person, but as an instrument in an internal script. This is the most important point. When the other becomes an object, violence stops being impulse and becomes function. Possible vulnerable narcissism. Here, the language needs to be careful. This is not diagnosing, but the story of rejection, the hunger for validation, and the need to beat the system are compatible with narcissistic traits where grandiosity is a shell protecting a fragile self. And in these profiles, rejection isn't sadness, it's intolerable humiliation. The University of Kentucky, in a science communication text on the subject, mentions how Bundy intrigued researchers for being articulate and not fitting the stereotype, reinforcing that he wasn't unique as a serial killer, but stood out because of the social mask. Romantic rejection, the kind of wound that becomes symbolic revenge. Romantic rejection appears frequently in the Bundy mythology. And here it's necessary to separate myth from mechanism. The relevant fact isn't a girlfriend broke up. The psychological point is, what did the breakup represent to him? In profiles with fragile grandiosity, love isn't attachment, it's a mirror. The person doesn't love to meet the other. They love to confirm their own superiority, their own desirability, their own worth. When the mirror breaks, what comes is a kind of fury that isn't only against the person who left, but against the experience of having been considered insufficient. And when that wound combines with fantasy and control, something dangerous is born. The need to reenact the humiliation in reverse. This time, I'm not the one without a choice. This time, I'm the one who decides who cries. This time, I'm the one who ends it. And I end it with the world. That helps explain why, in multiple cases, he sought targets that represented youth and promise. Not because he hated women as an abstract concept, but because young women could represent symbolically what he felt the world denied him: acceptance, desire, status, belonging. The choice of victims as a psychological symbol. It's not type, it's meaning. At the forensic level, the victim profile is young, often college-associated. But at the psychological level, the profile is different. Targets that made him feel powerful. In serial crimes with a sexual component and control, the victim often functions as a character in an internal theater. She can represent the unreachable ideal, the validation he wanted, the figure who rejected him, the wound reenacted, the society that judged him, humiliation turned into domination, or even his own sense of impotence, which must be crushed for him to breathe. What defines the type isn't only appearance, it's the possibility of capturing the narrative. A young woman alone in a routine context could be more easily isolated in an era without digital surveillance. But beyond that, she carries a symbol, a life expanding. And that is what the predator destroys to feel like he exists. The crime is a control machine. Bundy's behavioral signature, approaching in a trustworthy way, using devices like false vulnerability, exploiting social politeness, is practically a lesson in predatory manipulation. It's not just deceiving, it's infiltrating the victim's moral reflex. When he pretends to need help, he isn't only lowering suspicion, he's triggering something deep: the fear of seeming cruel, the desire to be good, the need to be seen as polite. The victim steps into an emotional trap before stepping into a physical trap. From a psychological standpoint, this offered Bundy 3 rewards. 1. The feeling of superiority. I can make you come. 2. The feeling of command. You're here because I decided. 3. The feeling of impunity. The world underestimates me, and I use that. The recurring manner of death, strangulation, asphyxiation, and blunt force violence described in historical sources and also discussed in Florida appeal records, reinforces this core of domination because they are means that imply contact and direct control. Triggers and escalation. When the mask starts to fail, the predator accelerates. One of the most important points in the Bundy case is escalation. He wasn't born in 1974. He was becoming. The FBI is explicit in saying that no one knows for sure when he killed for the first time. This leaves room for hypotheses, but it also shows that the beginning line is diffuse in serial criminals. Violence often has a history of fantasies and prior behaviors. What can be observed more firmly is that between 1974 and 1978, the pattern intensifies, and at certain moments, changes form. Two likely triggers appear indirectly in public material: frustration, threat to self-image. Life changes, failures, rejection, the sense of not reaching the desired status, sense of impunity. Each unsolved crime reinforces the belief, they don't catch me. And then comes a very concrete catalyst: the escapes. He escaped custody in Colorado in 1977, and at the turn of the year, managed to escape again and cross the country to Florida. The FBI describes that end-of-year escape as a key moment when staffing was reduced and he took advantage of the opportunity. Psychologically, a successful escape isn't just freedom. It functions like a drug, proof of power. It inflames the fantasy of invincibility. And in organized criminals, this often produces acceleration. More risk, more urgency, less patience for the social game. The Chi Omega attack in January 1978 is an example of a change in pattern. Instead of relying only on an approach in public space, there is a break-in and violence in an environment of sleep and vulnerability. The conviction and the Florida Supreme Court's decision describe the facts and the evidence supporting the case, including testimony and odontological forensic analysis. This shift suggests that something was degrading. Either control was turning into urgency, or the need for release was growing. In simple language, the crime stops being only hunting. It becomes compulsion. Declared motivation versus hidden motivation. Pornography. As a convenient narrative. In the final days before his execution, Bundy took part in a recorded interview with James Dobson, in which he spoke about pornography and violent media as roots of what he did, a statement that took on a life of its own in cultural debates. Psychologically, that declaration needs to be treated as what it most likely is, a final attempt to control the interpretation. This does not mean pornography consumption did not exist or that fantasies don't play a role in sexually violent crimes, but the point is, Bundy had an interest in shifting the center of the story to an external enemy. Pornography did this, because that serves important functions for a narcissistic, manipulative offender. He steps out of the role of author and tries to step into the role of social warning. He turns his own monstrosity into an example, almost a utility. He tries to buy time, relevance, and even a kind of pseudo-legacy. The most consistent hidden motivation, in light of the overall pattern and forensic literature, is different: control, possession, and domination, often fused with sexuality and fantasy of power. Even popular sources list control as a motive attributed to the case. And the FBI frames Bundy as part of a set of organized serial killers whose campaign involved manipulation and mobility. In other words, pornography may have been an accessory of his inner world, but it hardly explains the engine. The engine seems to be the need to defeat the feeling of impotence through total dominance over someone. Psychological function of the crime, what he gained by destroying. To understand why he killed, you have to ask, what did it deliver to him inside his head? In crimes like those attributed to Bundy, the gain usually isn't only sexual in the common sense. The gain is a package: immediate power, deciding the other person's fate. Repair of shame, turning "I was rejected" into "I reject humanity." Emotional anesthesia. During the act, anxiety and the feeling of inferiority can disappear, replaced by control. Confirmation of identity. I'm someone who can. Thrill of transgression. Breaking limits can become part of the reward. That's why many serial killers don't stop when they could stop. It isn't about external need. It's about an internal dependence on the ritual. The person doesn't seek only the outcome. They seek the psychological process that leads to the outcome. Compartmentalization. The double life as mental architecture. Bundy's double life wasn't a one-off trick, it was a structure. He studied, worked, dated, did politics, and in parallel, committed atrocities. This kind of compartmentalization usually requires two things. One, an ability to lie without collapsing. Lying here isn't only to others, it's to himself. I'm still the good person I look like. Two, emotional disconnection. A shutdown that allows switching between characters without visible guilt. From the outside, society asks, how did no one notice? The most honest answer is because the world is trained to look for evil in caricatures, and Bundy invested in being the opposite of a caricature. This even appears in contemporary analyses. He didn't fit the profile people imagined. This is a bitter forensic lesson. Some predators are good at seeming safe because they've spent their entire lives studying what people call safety. The mental loop: frustration, fantasy, planning, execution, relief, emptiness, repetition. To explain Bundy in a didactic way, without turning it into a technical lecture, the most useful model is the cycle. In many serial criminals, there is a loop that repeats and intensifies. Frustration, narcissistic injury. Something happens: rejection, humiliation, the feeling of being smaller than he wanted. It can be a real event or a paranoid reading. They don't respect me. The world becomes insult. Fantasy. The mind begins building a compensatory script. In fantasy, he isn't small, he is sovereign. Fantasy isn't a loose thought. It is an emotional rehearsal. It promises relief. Planning, preparation. This is where the organized predator differs. He doesn't rely only on impulse, he creates conditions. And by creating conditions, he already begins to feel power even before the crime. Planning becomes part of the pleasure because it returns to him the sensation of command. Approach, psychological capture. He gets close using social language, friendliness, politeness, apparent vulnerability. The victim, without knowing it, participates in the script because she was trained to be human. Execution, domination. The crime happens, and the central element isn't only killing, it's dominating, it's imposing, it's rewriting the other person's reality. Relief. For a short period, internal anxiety drops. The feeling of impotence is replaced by false calm, as if he had fixed something inside himself. Emptiness, emotional hangover. The relief doesn't last. The emptiness returns, sometimes with irritation, restlessness, the need to repeat in order to return to the state of control. Repetition with escalation. Over time, the ritual may demand more risk, more intensity, more urgency, because the brain learns that this is the fastest way to numb internal pain. This loop helps explain why he didn't stop when he could, why he crossed states, why he took bigger risks after the escapes, and why he tried to turn confession into currency at the end. Even on death row, he sought control of time, of discourse, of impact. Late confessions, guilt or strategy. Near the end, Bundy confessed to dozens of crimes and tried to negotiate information. In part, this can sound like remorse. But in manipulative profiles, late confession often has another function: prolong the game. Truth becomes an instrument. He decides what he gives and what he withholds. He makes investigators and families depend on one word from him, and that by itself can be one last kind of power. The same reasoning applies to the last words recorded in journalistic accounts. Send my love to my family and friends. It isn't necessary to deny that some affection may have existed, but it's important to notice how even at the end he tried to sustain an image, that of someone human enough to deserve a clean goodbye. The mask trying to survive its own collapse. Possible disorders and patterns, hypotheses without a clinical sentence. Without complete consensus evaluations, the ethical work is to speak in compatible patterns, not diagnosis. Bundy's behavioral cluster is often discussed in terms of antisocial psychopathic traits in the popular sense of the term. Emotional shallowness, manipulation, instrumental lying, lack of consistent remorse, repeated violation of norms. Narcissistic traits: need for admiration, intolerance of humiliation, entitlement, social theater. Possible sexual sadism, when the other person's suffering seems linked to the offender's psychological gain. What the analysis can state more safely is, he demonstrated a high capacity to instrumentalize people and to sustain a social persona while operating extreme violence. This is compatible with organized and cold profiles, studied by criminology for being especially difficult to detect in the beginning. Why he killed? Deep psychological conclusion, didactic and without romanticizing. Ted Bundy killed because killing was, for him, an internal solution. A monstrous solution, but functional within his psychological world. He didn't kill because he was sad. He killed because he wanted to be big and couldn't tolerate feeling small, because he needed to defeat an emptiness that ordinary life didn't fill, because he turned people into steps to climb inside his own fantasy of potency. Crime offered him a package that social life didn't deliver in a stable way. Absolute control, the opposite of rejection and insecurity. Immediate power, the opposite of feeling ordinary. Symbolic repair, reenacting the romantic and social wound as victory. Emotional anesthesia, silencing anxiety, shame, and frustration. Identity, being someone through the act of dominating. And why wasn't once enough? Because the feeling didn't last. Because the emptiness came back. Because the mask, no matter how polished, didn't heal what was underneath, only hid it. That's why he's a classic case. Because he exposed the comfortable lie that monsters look like monsters. Bundy looked normal enough to open doors, and it was through those doors that he devastated lives. In the end, the state killed him. But that doesn't solve what he represented. Proof that danger sometimes doesn't come screaming. It comes smiling. Part 8. The Final Reckoning. Lessons from the Darkness. When the name Ted Bundy was finally locked into a definitive file, with sentencing, execution, and headlines becoming the past, what remained wasn't silence. What remained was a kind of scar that doesn't show up in a photograph, a scar on trust. Because this case didn't only teach that there was a serial killer on the move, it taught that evil can learn manners. It can dress itself in normalcy, speak softly, smile at the right time, and say, "Thank you," with the natural ease of someone who would never do anything wrong. And that was perhaps the most corrosive part. Not the shock of a predator, but the discovery that the predator can be mistaken for an ordinary person, someone who could be in the grocery line, in the library, in a campus hallway. For the victims' families, the story didn't end with the electric chair on January 24th, 1989. A legal ending doesn't give back birthdays, doesn't give back routines, doesn't give back that simple human possibility of growing old with the people you love. The state closes a case, grief does not. And when the victims are young, grief takes an even crueler shape. It carries the feeling of a stolen future, as if a life had been cut off in the middle of a sentence. For society, the case left another inheritance: the need to mature the way we look. The world likes to divide people into good and bad by appearance, by the way they speak, by their education level, by their clothes. Bundy destroyed that fantasy, not because he was a genius, but because he understood a collective weakness, the tendency to trust superficial signals. He exploited what is best in people: politeness, willingness to help, belief in good faith, and turned those virtues into vulnerability. But the file also offers a less despairing lesson. It shows why forensic psychology, criminology, and integrated investigation matter. Not to turn tragedies into entertainment, but to reduce the space in which predators move. Understanding patterns, sharing information across states, studying repeated behaviors, all of that is often born from the highest price a society can pay. And this case cost far too much. Even so, there is a fundamental difference between understanding and admiring. This script does not exist to elevate Bundy into a fascinating character. It exists to expose the anatomy of a mechanism, a person who sought power and control as a substitute for humanity. And when someone uses another human being as an object, What is lost isn't only the victim's life. The person also loses their own ability to live with limits, empathy, and responsibility. In the end, Bundy tried to control even his own ending, with selective confessions, attempts at bargaining, public narrative. But there was something he couldn't control: the fact that despite all the masks, the victims remain the moral center of this story. His name is remembered because of what he destroyed, and that is a bitter kind of defeat. So an inevitable reflection remains, not to scare but to wake us up. How many times does society confuse good looks with good intentions? How many times does someone ignore an internal discomfort because they don't want to seem dramatic, rude, paranoid? And at the same time, how many times does generalized fear make the world colder, more closed off, less human? As if the answer to the predator were punishing everyone's trust. Maybe the hardest lesson is this: you don't have to live mistrusting everything, but you do have to understand that boundaries aren't a lack of kindness. They're self-care. Empathy doesn't mean putting yourself at risk, and seeming trustworthy isn't proof of anything. In the end, this case isn't only about one man. It's about what happens when charisma becomes a weapon, when the thirst for control finds institutional gaps, when violence feeds on silence and fragmentation. And the question that remains like an uncomfortable echo is simple and human. How many tragedies have to happen for society to learn to see past the mask? And the second question is even deeper. What can each of us do as a community to protect without dehumanizing, to prevent without turning the world into a place of permanent fear?